Stop scrolling. Because this isn't about hype. This is about leverage. About how one decision quietly exposed how fragile an entire sports ecosystem really is. Everyone thinks Caitlin Clark's rise is organic, inevitable, destiny. That's lazy thinking. What actually happened is far more uncomfortable and far more strategic. Here's the tension nobody wants to admit in women's basketball news right now. For decades, brands played it safe. They spread their bets. They hedged. They waited for the league to be ready. And then suddenly they didn't. They stopped pretending growth was a team effort and put everything behind one player. That's not inspiration. That's a calculated power move. Nike didn't choose Caitlin Clark because it was nice. They chose her because the old model stopped working. Ratings plateaued. Attention fractured. And women's basketball needed a gravitational center. Fast. Clark wasn't just visible. She was unavoidable. And that terrified people who benefited from the idea that no single player should ever matter this much. Here's the part most coverage avoids. A Super Bowl commercial isn't an ad. It's a declaration. It says, this is the face now. Not 5 years from now. Not after a resume builds. No. And that's where the shock actually starts. Because Caitlin Clark wasn't supposed to be here yet. She was still early. Still proving it. Still new to the professional stage. By traditional logic, she was a risk. But the numbers told a different story. One the league quietly relied on but never wanted to center. Every time she played, arenas filled. Every time her name hit a headline, casual fans clicked. Every time she appeared on camera, the algorithm listened. That's not popularity. That's infrastructure. And once brands realized that, the dominoes started falling fast. State Farm didn't put her next to Jake from State Farm by accident. They don't gamble on vibes. They test. They measure. They predict behavior. And what they saw wasn't just a college star. They saw someone who didn't feel forced on screen. Someone who didn't need a script to be watchable. Someone who turned advertising into entertainment without trying. That's rare. And it's dangerous for everyone else. Because the moment one athlete proves she can move views, money, and culture alone, the illusion of equal footing collapses. Now comparisons start. Now questions get uncomfortable. Now fans ask why the league feels invisible without her name attached. This is where the conversation shifts from celebration to conflict. From good for her to what does this mean for everyone else? And here's the cliffhanger you need to sit with. Caitlin Clark didn't just accept these deals. She chose how to be seen. She chose timing. She chose positioning. And in doing so, she forced women's basketball into a spotlight it wasn't fully prepared to control. Because once a league becomes dependent on one star, the next move decides everything. And that next move? That's where things get controversial. Here's the uncomfortable truth most women's basketball news outlets are dodging. Caitlin Clark didn't rise with the system. She rose past it. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because while fans were busy debating hype versus skill, brands were studying something else entirely, behavioral gravity. Who makes casual viewers stop scrolling? Who converts indifference into attention? Who doesn't just bring fans but brings new fans? That's the metric that breaks leagues. Clark didn't just perform on the court. She collapsed distance between hardcore basketball fans and people who hadn't watched a women's game in their lives. That's not normal. That's a shortcut leagues spend decades chasing. And when shortcuts appear, systems panic. Here's where tension starts building behind closed doors. The WNBA has spent years selling a collective story. It's bigger than one player. It's about the league. It's about equality across the roster. Nice messaging. Terrible business logic. Because attention doesn't work that way. It never has. The NBA didn't grow evenly. The NFL didn't grow evenly. Every major sports explosion in history has been pulled forward by one or two figures who became unavoidable. The difference? Those leagues embraced the imbalance. Women's basketball hesitated. And Caitlin Clark exposed that hesitation. When her games outdrew others by massive margins, it wasn't just impressive, it was destabilizing. When ticket prices spiked wherever she played, it created an uncomfortable comparison. When broadcasts promoted her name more than entire teams, it sent a signal nobody officially wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't favoritism. It was demand. And demand doesn't ask permission. Now here's where Clark's brilliance gets underestimated. She didn't fight the spotlight. She didn't overcorrect. She didn't play small to make others comfortable. She leaned in, but selectively. She showed up where visibility compounded. She spoke when silence would have diluted her presence. She didn't chase controversy, but she didn't hide from dominance either. That balance is rare. Most athletes either shrink under pressure or lean so hard into branding they lose authenticity. Clark did neither, which is exactly why brands trusted her. Because authenticity scales better than polish. Look at the State Farm campaign again. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't overproduced. It worked because she didn't feel like an athlete cameo. She felt like part of culture. That's the shift nobody wants to say out loud. Caitlin Clark stopped being just a basketball player before the league finished deciding how to market her. And that created friction. Players noticed. Fans noticed. Media noticed. Some celebrated it. Others quietly resented it. Because once one athlete becomes the economic engine, everything changes. Schedules matter more. Broadcast windows matter more. Marketing budgets stop being evenly distributed. And suddenly, conversations about fairness start sounding a lot like fear. Fear of dependency. Fear of irrelevance. Fear that if Clark slows down, the momentum slows with her. But here's the twist most critics miss. Caitlin Clark didn't ask to carry the league. The league handed her that weight by failing to build multiple stars with equal pull. That's not arrogance. That's consequence. And the real shock, she seems fully aware of it. Which leads to the decision that changed everything next. A decision that wasn't about basketball, endorsements, or even money. It was about control. And once she took that control, the entire conversation around women's basketball shifted from growth to dependence almost overnight. That's where the real backlash starts. Here's where the story stops being inspirational and starts being strategic. Because Caitlin Clark didn't just benefit from momentum, she redirected it. Most athletes let the system decide their narrative. They show up. They perform. They let leagues, networks, and sponsors package them however it's convenient. That's the default path. Clark didn't take it. Instead, she made a quiet but critical choice. She controlled access. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But deliberately. And in women's basketball news, that's almost unheard of. She didn't flood social media with forced branding. She didn't overexpose herself chasing short-term buzz. She appeared where the signal-to-noise ratio was highest, and skipped the rest. That restraint created scarcity. And scarcity creates value. This is where the gap between her and everyone else widened fast. Because while others were trying to be everywhere, Clark became selectively unavoidable. When she spoke, it mattered. When she appeared, it felt intentional. When she wasn't present, people noticed. That's power most players don't realize they're giving away. Now zoom out. Leagues depend on predictability. They want stars, but controllable ones. Faces that can be rotated. Narratives that can be adjusted. Momentum that doesn't hinge on a single decision maker. Caitlin Clark disrupted that comfort. Every time ratings spiked around her, the league gained leverage with networks, but lost leverage over the story. Because now broadcasters needed her more than she needed them. And that's when dynamics quietly flip. You could see it in the coverage. Segments framed around her presence, not just the matchup. Headlines that led with her name before the team. Conversations that asked, "Is Caitlin playing?" before, "Who's playing?" That's not bias. That's economics. And economics don't care about optics. Here's where critics started misfiring. They accused her of being overhyped, of being pushed, of being manufactured by media. That argument collapses under scrutiny. Manufactured stars don't pull organic viewership. They don't sustain attention across platforms. They don't make non-fans argue about them. Clark did all three. Which means the hype wasn't created, it was responded to. And that's what made her next move so shocking. Instead of using her momentum to dominate headlines non-stop, she pulled back just enough to let anticipation build. She didn't explain herself. She didn't over-defend. She didn't play the validation game. Silence, when chosen, is louder than any press conference. This frustrated people who wanted her boxed into familiar roles. The humble rookie. The grateful star. The league-first ambassador. She didn't reject those labels. She simply didn't perform them. And that unsettled a system that relies on predictability. Here's the critical tension. Women's basketball needs stars to grow. But it also fears what happens when one star becomes indispensable. Clark sits right in that contradiction. If she thrives, the league benefits, but loses narrative control. If she stumbles, the league risks exposure. That's not pressure she created. That's pressure she inherited by being effective. And now every decision she makes, on camera, off camera, in partnerships, in silence, carries weight beyond basketball. Because she's no longer just playing games. She's shaping incentives. And the next chapter isn't about whether she can handle it. It's about whether the league can. Because what happens when a system built on collective messaging collides with a singular force who doesn't need permission? That's where the real test begins. Here's where the story turns uncomfortable, for fans, media, and the league itself. Because once Caitlin Clark proved she could move attention on her own terms, the question stopped being how big can she get? It became how much of the league actually depends on her? And that's not a flattering question. Look at the patterns. Games without her? Attendance drops. National buzz softens. Casual fans disengage. Games with her? Everything spikes. Tickets, social clips, debate, outrage, praise. That contrast is not subtle. It's measurable. And leagues hate measurable dependence. In women's basketball news, this created a silent fracture. Officially, everyone celebrated growth. Privately, there was anxiety. Because growth tied to one name isn't stable growth, it's fragile growth. And Caitlin Clark knows this. That's why her next move wasn't louder branding. It was positioning. She leaned into moments that reinforced legitimacy, not novelty. Primetime games. High-pressure environments. Situations where failure would be visible and success would be undeniable. That's not confidence. That's calculation. Because dominance in low-stakes moments builds fans. Dominance when stakes are high builds authority. And authority is what changes how history remembers players. Here's the twist most people miss. Clark didn't try to become the face of women's basketball. She became the reference point. Every conversation now loops back to her. Is this game drawing like a Clark game? Is this rookie impacting like Clark did? Is this moment big, or just big without her? That kind of gravity reshapes perception permanently. But it also breeds resentment. Some players feel overshadowed. Some analysts frame her coverage as excessive. Some fans accuse the media of obsession. That backlash isn't about Clark's behavior. It's about displacement. When attention concentrates, someone always loses it. And instead of pretending that's not happening, Clark does something smarter. She ignores the noise entirely. No public feuds. No defensive interviews. No social media monologues. She lets performance answer questions people are afraid to ask directly. That restraint is dangerous in the best way, because it leaves critics arguing with numbers instead of narratives. Now here's the moment everything sharpened. A major broadcast quietly restructured its promotional strategy around her games. Not officially announced. Not framed as favoritism. Just a noticeable shift in time slots, marketing spend, and pre-game storytelling. That's when it became undeniable. The league wasn't just benefiting from Clark. It was adjusting around her. And once institutions start adjusting, the power dynamic flips permanently. This is where history diverges. Some leagues panic and try to dilute the star. They spread attention thin. They talk up parity. They resist imbalance. Other leagues lean in and explode. Women's basketball is standing at that fork right now. And Caitlin Clark, whether she wants it or not, is the deciding variable. The shocking part? She hasn't made her most disruptive move yet. Because what happens next isn't about games, ratings, or endorsements. It's about ownership of the future narrative. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. This is where the conversation stops being theoretical and starts threatening real power. Because the moment Caitlin Clark becomes unavoidable, the next question becomes dangerous. Who actually owns women's basketball right now? The league? The networks? Or the player driving the demand? That question is never asked out loud, but it shapes every decision behind the scenes. Here's the reality nobody likes admitting. Leagues don't grow because they're fair. They grow because they're watchable. And watchability almost always has a face. Clark became that face faster than anyone predicted. Not because she demanded it, but because the audience chose her. And once the audience chooses, institutions react. Slowly at first, then all at once. Look at how coverage shifted. Storylines stopped being about rebuilding teams and long-term development. They became about moments, records, milestones, impact. That's star-centric media, and it doesn't reverse easily. Now here's where Clark's brilliance turns almost invisible. She didn't politicize her position. She didn't position herself against the league. She simply behaved like someone who knew her value. That's the difference. Most athletes overplay leverage. They talk too much. They posture. They force confrontations. Clark did the opposite. She let others argue about fairness while she focused on inevitability. Because inevitability is the strongest negotiating position there is. And it showed in the way brands approached her. They didn't pitch exposure. They pitched alignment. They didn't offer experiments. They offered commitment. That's a subtle but massive shift. It means brands stopped asking, "Can she carry this?" and started asking, "How do we plug into what she's already carrying?" That mindset changes deal structure. It changes creative control. It changes how much say an athlete has in how they're portrayed. Which brings us to the moment that rattled the league internally. Clark declined opportunities she didn't need. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. And every quiet no increased the weight of her yes. That's when executives realized this wasn't a phase. This wasn't a hype cycle. This was a power shift that couldn't be scheduled or scripted. Meanwhile, critics kept missing the point. They argued whether she was the best. They debated comparisons. They obsessed over percentages and matchups. Wrong conversation. The real story isn't dominance on the stat sheet. It's dominance in attention economics. And attention economics don't reward humility, they reward clarity. Clark's clarity is ruthless. She knows what moments matter. She knows which stages amplify her impact. And she knows that not every opportunity is equal, even if it looks prestigious on paper. That's maturity most players don't reach until the end of their careers. Which is why what comes next scares people. Because once a player understands leverage this early, the long-term implications get uncomfortable. Broadcast negotiations, scheduling priorities, marketing narratives. They all start bending toward one axis. And if the league doesn't adapt fast enough, it risks being defined by one name instead of strengthened by it. That's the paradox Caitlin Clark represents. And the next move, already in motion, will either lock in this era or expose just how unprepared the system really is. This is the part nobody in women's basketball news wants to frame honestly. Because once Caitlin Clark becomes the axis, neutrality disappears. Every decision starts looking like a choice for her or around her. And institutions hate that spotlight. Here's what's actually happening beneath the surface. The league isn't just managing growth anymore, it's managing imbalance. Not in talent, in attention. That's harder. Talent can be drafted, developed, redistributed. Attention cannot. It flows where interest concentrates, and right now it's concentrated heavily in one direction. Clark didn't create that reality, but she benefits from it, and she doesn't apologize for that. That's where the friction escalates. Some voices demand redistribution, more coverage for others, more balance and promotion, more team-first storytelling. That instinct feels moral. It's also strategically naive, because audiences don't follow fairness. They follow momentum, and momentum is fragile. If you dilute it too early, you don't spread growth, you kill it. This is where Clark's situation becomes a stress test for the entire league. Can women's basketball do what other leagues did decades ago? Embrace the star and build outward? Or will it resist, flattening its own trajectory in the name of optics? Clark's behavior suggests she already knows the answer. She doesn't campaign. She doesn't lobby. She doesn't respond to every narrative. She lets the league reveal itself through how it handles her existence. That's an advanced move, because pressure exposes priorities, and pressure is mounting. Every time her games outperform others, it raises an uncomfortable data point. Every time coverage leans toward her, it forces justification. Every time new fans enter through her, it exposes how thin the funnel was before. You can't unsee that. And then there's the generational factor. Clark isn't pulling in just existing basketball fans. She's pulling in people who don't care about tradition. They don't know the old hierarchies. They don't feel loyalty to past narratives. They came for her. That audience doesn't want lectures about balance. They want moments, which puts the league in a bind. Because catering to legacy fans while ignoring new ones is how relevance dies. And catering to new fans while alienating the old ones creates backlash. There's no clean solution, only trade-offs. And Caitlin Clark sits at the center of every one of them. The shocking thing? She's not rushing to resolve the tension. She's letting it play out. Because time is on her side. Every season she performs, her position strengthens. Every new viewer who enters through her becomes part of her gravity. Every successful broadcast built around her raises the cost of sidelining her. That's leverage compounding. And compounding leverage eventually forces decisions. The league will either formalize her centrality or keep pretending it doesn't exist. Both paths have consequences, but only one leads to real growth. And the signs suggest a decision is coming sooner than anyone expected. Because the next shift won't come from a game-winning shot or a viral clip. It will come from a structural change. And when that happens, it will confirm what this entire story has been pointing toward. Caitlin Clark isn't changing women's basketball by accident. She's changing it by being impossible to ignore. This is where the illusion finally cracks. Because once Caitlin Clark becomes the standard, pretending she's just another player stops working. Standards create comparisons. Comparisons create pressure. And pressure exposes gaps the league has spent years covering with good intentions and bad math. Here's the part nobody wants to admit in women's basketball news. Clark didn't just raise the ceiling. She exposed how low the floor still is. When one player can swing viewership this dramatically, it forces an ugly question. Why wasn't the system built to support multiple stars like this already? That's not a critique of players. It's a critique of strategy. For years, the league sold potential instead of payoff. Promise instead of proof. Clark delivered proof. And proof changes expectations overnight. Fans don't want to hear about growth curves anymore. They've seen what's possible. They've tasted momentum. And now they want more of it. That's dangerous if you're not ready. Because once expectations reset, there's no going back to patience. This is why resistance around Clark sometimes feels emotional rather than rational. It's not jealousy. It's fear of exposure. Exposure that the league underinvested in star building. Exposure that marketing lagged behind demand. Exposure that narratives were prioritized over numbers. Clark didn't cause those issues. She illuminated them. And illumination makes people uncomfortable. Now watch how language shifts around her. Words like sustainable, balanced, and responsible start appearing more often. Those are usually signals, not of concern, but of hesitation. Because what they really mean is, we're not sure how to scale this without losing control. Clark, meanwhile, keeps doing the simplest thing possible. She performs. No speeches. No positioning. No explanations. That consistency is lethal to doubt. And here's the most underreported aspect of her rise. She's teaching the next generation of players something the league never formalized. Visibility isn't granted. It's taken through relevance. Young players are watching how brands respond to her, how networks treat her, how silence works in her favor. That changes behavior. Future stars won't wait for permission. They'll build gravity first and let institutions catch up. That's a cultural shift, not just a career arc. And once that mindset spreads, the league either adapts or fractures. Because a system built on equal messaging can't survive unequal impact. It has to choose. Lean into reality or fight it. And Caitlin Clark, intentionally or not, is forcing that choice. The shocking part? This isn't the peak of her influence. It's the setup. Because everything so far has been about attention. What comes next is about control. And once control enters the equation, the balance of power shifts permanently. That moment hasn't been announced yet, but the signs are already there. And when it arrives, it will redefine how women's basketball operates, for everyone, not just her. This is where the conversation turns from uncomfortable to unavoidable. Because once Caitlin Clark's influence spreads beyond games and into decision-making, the old structure starts to wobble. Up until now, the league could frame her impact as performance-driven. Points, crowds, ratings. But influence doesn't stop at the scoreboard. It leaks into scheduling, into marketing budgets, into broadcast priorities, into which stories get told and which quietly disappear. That's control without a title. And that's what makes institutions nervous. In women's basketball news, there's a silent assumption that players should inspire, but not steer. That they should elevate the product, but never reshape it. Clark is breaking that assumption just by existing at her current scale. Because once fans tune in for her, networks start asking different questions. Why isn't she in the prime window? Why isn't this matchup highlighted? Why isn't this rivalry built out? Those questions don't come from her camp. They come from demand. And demand is louder than any memo. Here's the critical shift most people miss. When influence becomes systemic, it stops being about individual achievement and starts being about precedent. If Clark gets this level of centrality, future stars will expect it. They'll demand infrastructure built around them, not abstract ideals. That's a cultural rewrite. And rewrites always create resistance. Some argue this undermines team identity. Others warn it creates dependency. Others cloak discomfort in language about fair coverage. But history is brutal on leagues that ignore momentum. The ones that win are the ones that ride the wave early, even if it feels risky. Clark's presence is that wave. And here's where her intelligence shows again. She doesn't publicly push for structural change. She lets the system bend first. Because systems that bend reveal where they're weakest. Every special broadcast, every tailored promo, every adjustment made quietly to accommodate her draw, it all leaves a paper trail. That trail becomes leverage later. And this is where things get sharp. Because leverage doesn't have to be used to be powerful. Just having it reshapes behavior. You can see it in how conversations tiptoe around her now. Careful praise. Qualified criticism. A constant awareness that whatever happens next, she's central to it. That's not favoritism. That's dependency awareness. And dependency changes incentives fast. The league can't afford to alienate her. Networks can't afford to underutilize her. Sponsors can't afford to misalign with her. That triangle creates a new center of gravity. One that didn't exist before. And here's the part fans rarely consider. This shift isn't just about Caitlin Clark. It's about what happens after her. If the league learns to build outward from a star, the ecosystem strengthens. If it resists, it risks cycling through brief spikes instead of sustained growth. Clark is the test case, and tests reveal truths. The final question isn't whether she deserves this influence. It's whether the league can evolve fast enough to handle it. Because the next phase won't be forgiving. Once control becomes explicit, there's no pretending this is accidental. And that moment, where influence turns into authority, is closer than it looks. This is where the narrative tightens, and excuses run out. Because at this stage, Caitlin Clark's impact isn't speculative. It's structural. The league can no longer claim it's too early to assess what she represents. Too early for what? The data is in. The behavior is visible. The audience has already voted. And that's the part that makes people uneasy. Because audiences don't care about internal politics. They don't care about legacy hierarchies. They don't care about how things used to work in women's basketball news. They care about what feels electric now. Clark feels electric. And electricity reroutes systems whether they're ready or not. Here's the brutal truth. The league is already being judged through her lens. When a broadcast underperforms without her, fans notice. When a big game lacks buzz, they compare it, implicitly or explicitly, to her presence. When new players arrive, the question isn't, are they good? It's, can they move the needle like Clark? That comparison is unfair. It's also inevitable. And inevitability doesn't ask permission. This is where leadership gets tested. Because leagues don't fail when they lack talent. They fail when they refuse to adapt their structures to reality. Right now, reality is this. Caitlin Clark is the strongest entry point into women's basketball for new audiences. Not one of the strongest. That doesn't diminish anyone else. But it does demand clarity. Either the league builds a system that multiplies her impact, using her as the engine to elevate others, or it treats her like an anomaly to be managed. One path compounds growth. The other caps it. Clark herself hasn't forced the decision, but her consistency is accelerating it. Every time she delivers under pressure, the argument for restraint weakens. Every time she handles attention without imploding, the fear-based narratives lose credibility. Every time she draws new fans, the old justifications sound thinner. And here's the subtle but critical shift happening now. Media coverage is no longer asking if she's the face. It's asking how long the league can pretend she isn't. That's not hype. That's recognition catching up to reality. Behind the scenes, this changes everything. Negotiations get reframed. Scheduling conversations get sharper. Marketing strategies get rewritten with fewer abstractions and more specifics. That's what happens when a star becomes a pillar. And pillars change architecture. The dangerous mistake would be thinking this moment is self-sustaining. It's not. Momentum still needs structure to survive. If the league leans in, it can build rivalries, narratives, and platforms that extend beyond one name. If it resists, it risks creating a single point of failure, where growth rises and falls with one player's availability. That's the crossroads. And Caitlin Clark is standing in the middle of it, not by ambition but by outcome. The final irony? She's done everything right. She's performed. She's stayed composed. She's avoided unnecessary conflict. She's let results speak. Which means whatever happens next won't be about her readiness. It will be about the league's courage. Because the last step in this evolution isn't attention or influence. It's acknowledgement. And once acknowledgement becomes official, the era changes. There's only one part left to this story. The part where the league chooses what it wants to become. This is the moment everything settles into focus. Not with an announcement. Not with a press release. But with a choice. Because Caitlin Clark didn't force women's basketball to change. She revealed that it already had to. That's the difference. For years, the league talked about growth as something distant, something gradual, something that required patience and collective belief. Clark collapsed that timeline. She proved demand wasn't missing. It was waiting for a focal point. And once that focal point appeared, every weakness in the system became visible. That's not her responsibility to fix, but it is her legacy to define. The shock isn't that brands bet on her early. The shock is that they were right, and everyone else hesitated. Nike didn't gamble. State Farm didn't experiment. They followed signals the league itself was slow to trust. And now, those signals are impossible to ignore. Here's the final truth that settles this entire debate. Caitlin Clark isn't changing women's basketball by being louder, flashier, or more controversial. She's changing it by being reliable in moments that used to feel risky. Reliable ratings. Reliable attention. Reliable conversion of casual interest into sustained engagement. That's not stardom. That's infrastructure. And infrastructure outlives narratives. The future of women's basketball won't be defined by whether Clark wins every game. It will be defined by whether the league learns how to build with her gravity instead of fighting it. If it does, this era becomes the foundation for something bigger, more stars, deeper rivalries, broader reach. If it doesn't, history will remember this as a missed acceleration point. Clark's role in that outcome is already complete. She showed what was possible. She held the attention. She didn't flinch. Now the spotlight shifts. Not to her. To the league. Because the real shock wasn't Caitlin Clark's rise. It was how unprepared the system was to handle success when it finally arrived. And that's the kind of moment that defines sports history, not in highlights but in decisions made when no one is watching.